So with that, we're going to change gears a little bit and have an academic industry panel. Mary Loesch is going to coordinate that, so I'm going to introduce Mary Loesch. She's a faculty member here at University of Northern Iowa and a social scientist, and she's put together a very great panel for us today. So, Mary.
Thank you, and I would invite the panelists to come up and get settled. Hi, Craig. Nice to see you. I'll do introductions in just a moment as they're getting settled. I would just, by way of context, say that we just heard quite a bit from the Lieutenant Governor about collaborations, especially where STEM is concerned. And we're continuing that theme. If we have good collaborations and the STEM initiative is as successful as we hope it will be, we will continue to populate both business and academics with lots of folks who are ready to do a lot of good work. And as universities are increasingly called upon to be economic engines, which was not as much the case, I think, a decade ago, and we also look at increasing competition for funding to generate new knowledge, new information, whether we're talking about an academic setting or a business setting, we have lots of pressure being brought to bear to do more collaborative work. And so that's the background for today's panel. And we hope that basically from their perspectives, they're going to provide some important perspectives about collaborations. And we're using collaboration broadly across institutions, be that a community college with a university with a four-year college, or whether we're talking about business and industry collaborating with academics as well. I'm going to go through some brief introductions, and then after the introductions, you can thank the panelists with me, and then we will start in a little bit with some questions for them. First here I have Rob Denson, president of Des Moines Area Community College. He has been the president since 2003. He is the first native-born president of DMAC. He has about 20 years of experience in academic administration of various types. He has degrees in political science, in higher education, and he has a Juris Doctorate as well. So he's got a good deal of experience in education and business collaboration throughout those years, I would imagine, not just recently. And we have Lisa Lorenzen, who's the executive director of the ISU Research Foundation. And the Research Foundation owns and manages the intellectual property. It's focused on technology transfer and economic development. And previous to the work at Iowa State as the Executive Director of the Research Foundation, we also have work as a computational biologist. So with a PhD in genetics, that kind of work obviously was very much related to, I'm sure, the things that she could bring to bear on those conversations with a lot of the work that goes on with industry and academic collaborations there at Iowa State. I skipped over Robin, and Robin, pronounce your last name for me.
Habeger.
Habeger, thank you. Academic outreach manager for DuPont Pioneer. She manages relationships with universities. We often need to be managed, I know that. Leads their K-12 STEM educational initiative, administers the online grant management system, and previously was corporate development officer at Iowa State. She's got, and by way of background, master's degrees in community and regional planning and an MBA focusing on management information systems. And we also have Craig Just. Craig, in addition to his work at, on the EPSCoR project, you heard a little bit about that earlier, has a doctorate in environmental engineering and science from the University of Iowa. He's assistant professor in Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And his work involves a collaboration, the work that he's doing right now. There may be many others, but currently is involved in collaborations that you heard a little bit about earlier today. And lastly, we have Brent Shanks. He is the Mike and Jean Stephenson Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Iowa State University. He's Director of the NSF Engineering Research Center for Biorenewable Chemicals. His work focuses on the research and development of novel, heterogeneous catalyst systems for efficiently converting biological-based feedstocks to chemicals and fuels. I imagine that keeps him very busy. So join me in welcoming the panel, please. I'm going to start, and we will do some questions here, have them talk to you. They can talk to each other. We're going to keep it fairly informal. And then after, we will have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions as well. My first question for the panel, given that institutions and industry businesses have different missions and different cultures associated with them, we know that collaborations are complicated and time-consuming. Why should we bother? And you all jump in, fight amongst yourselves.
Well, I think initially, and in the end, business hires our students, uses our research, and commercializes our outcomes. So I think they're a very necessary part of the process, and that, at least at the community college level, I know this is true in other areas also, every one of our vocational programs and many of our other programs are actually managed by a board of advisors of the businesses from the industries that hire our students. So they tell us exactly, what training is needed, what competencies, what equipment. So we're very connected to business and industry, and we go to them for information. You're all familiar with the higher ed handshake. It's always asking for money. Well, that's not what they best give to us. They give us great advice to make sure that we're actually delivering a product, which is a skilled workforce that can actually go to work in Iowa and make something happen.
Speaking from the industry side, we realize that we cannot do it ourselves. We actually value our university and actually relationships all up and down the chain, including our K through 12 outreach efforts that we're doing with education, because those teachers, if we're doing externships or working with them in mentoring type of roles, they come in and they can ask some of those why questions that we're so down in the trenches and in the weeds that maybe we sometimes forget to look at the really big picture, so they can come in and do some process improvement for us. And with any of our educational partners, they are our pipeline for the next generation of workforce. And so we have to be partnering with them not only on research but on training that next round of employees, that it's important for us to manage those relationships, and so moving forward we can identify the best talent.
I think Rob said it well from the education perspective. I mean, if we took the easy route and went our separate ways, then we would make it more difficult to solve all of the challenging problems that we both need to solve on both sides. So there's motivation to figure out how to work together to bring the different perspectives, different cultures together and attack these larger problems.
It looks like we're going in order here, so I guess it's my turn. I guess part of it is the assumption with the way the question was given to us is that our missions are different. I'm not so sure they are, depending on which part of the mission that you might focus on for each of these institutions, but the way we go about achieving the mission is many times very different, and that's what makes the collaborations very difficult. But they've always, I think the old adage is, if you want to go fast, go by yourself, and if you want to go far, go with others. And so if you're looking at a long-term sort of a goal or a mission to be achieved, it's always better to collaborate as best you can. From my perspective, I'm a born and bred Iowan. I'm in my 20th year at Iowa, but I've only been on the tenure track about a year and a half. And so I was doing a lot of these collaborations before I joined the tenure track. Now, if you ask me if these time spent on these collaborations is wise as an assistant untenured professor, I might have to give you a slightly different answer. So I'm very grateful that I built many of these collaborations up over time before I joined the tenure track. But nonetheless, I would say again, with the longer trajectory of having an academic career, the way I view that, I think the collaborations will be well worth the time and effort put in.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add. I think that there's been great comments from everyone. I think one thing to realize is collaborations come in a number of different flavors. There's collaborations that are on the education side. So I'm going to speak more to research collaborations. So as I see collaborations going forward in the 21st century, I think the problems have gotten larger, and the idea that we can work on these as individuals won't work. I mean, it's not new that we've worked on solar energy. It's not new that we've worked on biomass conversion. So what's different now from when we did this in 1980? And the answer is we have more advanced, sophisticated techniques that we can look at those problems. Well, we can't each be experts in those techniques. And so collaboration, in my opinion, becomes absolutely essential in the 21st century as we go after these very difficult problems. And so I don't think it's a matter of whether we have a choice or not. I think it's that we don't have a choice. I think the nature of the individual scientist or engineer in a lab doing useful things where they publish a paper on it, those days are in the past. And I think we have a new world that we're going into in the 21st century. So to me, that's the basis of collaboration.
And I think one thing education needs to do a better job of is reaching out to business. I mean, you can't expect them just to think you're wonderful and show up at your door. I mean, you have to be out where they are. I mean, at their associations, at their organizations, just what we've done today, and I talked to Barry earlier, just what you've talked about as your platform deliverables already are amazing. But we need to reach out to the business communities and let them see what this group is actually doing. That gets them excited. You've got groups like Association of Business and Industry, the Iowa Business Council. I mean, these are big statewide groups that you can get engaged in, and you need to be at some of their meetings, at some of their conferences, sponsoring their events. I mean, they need to see you as being interested in them, not always them having to, or you thinking they're just going to come and knock on your door. I mean, they need to be partners, but they need to see you actually putting some skin in the game.
Any other follow-ups there? Well, okay, I'm convinced. All right, now so we'll collaborate. But in addition to, I think, what Rob just mentioned, there are some challenges. So what are the key challenges from your perspectives and or barriers to collaborations in this context?
Do we want to mix that?
Yeah,
Guys,
go in a
ahead.
different order.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. You want to go first?
I think what make collaborations work is when everyone involved with the collaboration brings some value to that collaboration. And I think that's also the challenge of making collaborations work, is how to make sure that those that if you have too much overlap with who you're collaborating with, there's a tendency for some people to say, I don't need this collaboration anymore. And so the key is to be very clear as to what the value proposition is for each of the people in the collaboration. That's what allows it to go forward. So in my view, that's the key piece of this, is how to make sure, with all the outreach and things like that, I still think you have to have a unique value proposition when you go into that collaboration, and you need to find a collaboration partner that complements what you bring in, and that's what, first of all, makes it worth the time, because it does take time to reach out, and second of all, allows you to do something really unique and interesting when they have complementary things that they bring to the collaboration.
And I would add that we need to make sure that the collaboration doesn't just go across the science, but that it goes the other direction too, that there's collaborators on the business side where the end that I work on is the contracting, and then the contracting at the beginning, and then the patenting and licensing after the research is done. And the more all of that is brought together at the beginning and during the process, the more everyone sees that common goal and can move forward in the same direction, instead of kind of stumbling over each other and trying to figure it out after the fact.
I agree with that. And one of the things to keep in mind is, as Brent actually alluded to, was that there is a corporate culture, there is a culture of your institution, and making sure that those align and can work together. Yes, we are working on a big problem, but there's also the speed of doing business and the speed of the university. And I can say that because I've worked in both organizations. The speed of doing business is much faster. And sometimes getting university and education to understand that can be somewhat challenging, but if you all sit down around the table like Lisa said and have the list of, okay, this is where we're going, this is the goals, the core benefit proposition that we're doing for both organizations, and setting those expectations up to begin with, it's very helpful.
And just to add a little bit to that, I think the business needs to understand, and you need to understand, what the value proposition is for the business. I mean, why should they do it? I mean, one barrier is that their first reaction is going to be that you want money and their time, and that the relationship's all one way, them to you. So you need to be able to explain to them what's the value proposition for them. And second, if you ask, you've got to listen. I mean, you just can't have them tell you what their concerns are and they say, okay, that's all very nice, now here's what we want you to do. I mean, it gets a little messy when business really starts to tell you what they want from you and why you haven't been performing to the level that they've expected, and they'll tell you horror stories about prior events with your institution. So you've got to be ready to deal with that and then show them that it's a new ball game.
I'll follow up too. You got to be prepared to, speaking of culture and institutions and different things like that, you'll learn some things about your own institution's culture that you didn't know about. For me, I thought it was a great idea to have a Kirkwood Community College internship program. Well, it is a good idea, and it remains to be one. And but
come see us.
Yeah, that's right. And it's like, well, these interns should be paid, right? I mean, it shouldn't just be for free. And so we have an hourly commitment. I essentially did the value proposition between Kirkwood and the University of Iowa. We laid it all out, the number of hours. Benefiting the architectural technology program there and their construction management program, and then benefiting our project here. And they wanted to do that for 2 semesters for their second-year students. And so that would, that'd be about a 9-month, or it could even be a 12-month kind of an appointment. And so they're appointed as a temporary worker, a temporary employee of the University of Iowa under that constraint. New rules this year is that no temporary worker at the University of Iowa can be appointed more than 4 months. And so they're classified as that. And I'm like, wow, I don't understand that rule, and it really doesn't help me facilitate my internship program that I set up before. I understand why they've got that in place. In fact, if this Kirkwood intern, if the interns work a day over 4 months, then they become permanent employees of the University of Iowa, and the only way they can be let go is for performance, not failure to perform, essentially. And so, wow, that's a big constraint with respect to the logistics of doing that, and I had no idea something like that would exist when I set it up. So now we have to kind of rearrange a little bit. Those are things you learn along the way too, and without the support on our own end, that I would probably drop the program because it's not something an assistant professor should be dealing with, for sure.
I guess I'd add to Robin's point on the speed. That's a good news, bad news thing for the academics. I mean, one, we have to learn how to speed up to respond, but the flip side is companies can also change at a drop of a hat. And so as an academician, you have to be very careful how you set up a collaboration with a company. If the person that you're got the collaboration with that company ends up moving to a different place in the company, and then someone inherits that role, all of a sudden their priorities could change and the project can take a right angle turn. And so you have to think really hard about how you engage students with the time frame they have, with the projects they're supposed to do, how to work that with companies. It's happened to me personally several times where we thought we had a multi-year agreement. Companies had changes in priority, and all of a sudden it stopped after a year. Well, if you have a graduate student, that's not a fair thing to do. So this is all part of understanding the expectations and the value proposition going in. And so there is definitely some downside with that speed that companies are used to. And I worked for Shell before I came to Iowa State. We're used to, we can change on a dime what we're doing. We can pull researchers from one area and say, this is now our top priority next week, which was different from what it was last week. You can't do that with a student. You can't say, okay, this is your line of your master's or PhD thesis, and now all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, you're going down this direction. And so that's under the challenge part of the collaboration that you really need to think through in how you set those up.
I'd actually like to spend just a little bit more time on this because I think these examples are very helpful to people. A couple of things that we haven't talked as much about in the world of challenges, at least directly, are issues of what's mine, what's yours, and what's ours. And for those of you who are in the intellectual property world and technology transfer and those sorts of things, can be particularly sticky in these sorts of collaborations. So if you've had experience with that, as an investigator, please talk a little bit about that. As an administrator or as someone who's sort of day in and day out is related to that.
So Zev's looking at me like, Lisa, this is your question. Yes, the tech transfer office, this is the world that I live in every day. And, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there weren't really three answers. It was, it's ours, of course. What other answer would there be? And I'm being a little sarcastic, but the traditional university way of working with industry is that the faculty that work for the university, if they invent it, that's the university property. Now, that's consistent with companies. When you work for a company, your intellectual property is that company's. And there is no flexibility. It's the company's. On the university side, as the last few years have evolved, we've been developing more flexibility in that when it comes to research that's been sponsored by industry. And both the University of Iowa and Iowa State about 6 months ago announced a new policy where we can be a little more open on that with companies. And while the new option didn't change the ownership of the IP, we still think if you're an inventor and you work for an institution, that institution should own your IP. If you're a company researcher and you work for that company, your company should own it. If you invent it together, you both co-own it. But the financial risk for companies was something that kept coming up over and over and over again. Okay, I get it that you own it, but I paid for the research, and now you're telling me I have to pay to commercialize this, and I have no idea how much you're going to charge me. So there was a great financial risk, and the new policy we came out with kind of eliminated that financial risk with some upfront terms for licensing. Iowa State also has a policy that we can assign ownership under certain conditions. So you guys don't care about the details, but the bottom line is that the universities, and it's not just in Iowa, we're starting to see this across the nation, are paying attention to those concerns of industry and trying to address the ones that we can. And most recently, we've been addressing the financial risk concerns.
From the company side, I'll say this: we have a team of lawyers that deals with it. It's not me. I have no idea.
Robin, do you have any anecdotes?
I can tell them what Pioneer.
Oh, she probably can. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it would be. I'm interested in sort of illuminating a little bit about these issues and thinking about timing. I mean, it gets back to Craig's point about logistics, because whether we're talking about differential speed or whether we're talking about how long it's going to take us to get to the point where we can actually start so that speed even becomes an issue between the two. What are some of the time frames? What are some of the anecdotes about where it worked well, where it didn't? That'd be great.
I can give a Pioneer example of where it's non-traditional, and it's because of the changing commercial world out there. Germplasm. Whenever we do work with Pioneer at germplasm, it is an exception to our policy. They own any of the germplasm that comes out of the work that they fund. And 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, they didn't. 10 years ago, they didn't, somewhere in the 10 to 5. And the reason it had to change was because of the regulations related to genetically modified organisms, so GMOs. When the BT corn and the Roundup Ready soybeans came out, the world changed in terms of litigation. and in terms of the risk that the companies undertook working with those crops. So that changed what their relationship with us had to be, and the university, quite frankly, didn't have deep enough pockets to protect the results of the research. So whenever it's germplasm that we're working on with them, we freely give up that ownership because they need that in order to legally protect their product and to be able to commercialize it and get all the value from it.
And if it makes a difference, we do provide high school and middle school teachers with seed, untreated seed for them to do experiments in their classrooms. We require them to sign an agreement as to how they're using the seed before it even leaves our door. So that is how seriously we protect our germplasm.
I was associate university attorney for the University of Florida for 3 years and did their patent licensing, and what I can tell you is that there are no, I mean, every conversation you have as a researcher with a business has a consequence. So if you start to, even if it's casual conversation, and to protect yourself, your institution, and the business, you need to have a clear understanding as to, you know, what are the potential outcomes and who owns what. I mean, it's you know, it's like a prenuptial agreement. I mean, they're hard to have, but boy, they can really come back to bite you if you don't understand the ground rules going in.
And even from the business side, I get pressure of, oh, we're just starting conversations with XYZ University about general relationship topics. Our legal wants to assign an attorney to that leadership management team right out of the gate, so that any initial conversations that happen are covered in that prenuptial agreement.
One of the things I'm really interested in is writing NSF proposals with broader impacts, and one of the things that appeal to me is the idea that there might be an industry partnership not funded by industry with respect to the research, but that there might be some IP generated during the NSF funded research, but then the broader impacts might be something where you have some upfront agreements perhaps with certain industrial partners that then they might get some exclusive rights to commercialize those things. I'm not a commercialization person, that's not really my job. But with respect to broader impacts, I'd love to be able to say that some of those, you know, understandings have been made ahead of time and have that written right into the proposal with the expectation that we feel, if fully successful, will have valuable IP and that it will leave the university boundaries in bountiful ways. And I'm a little unclear on how to really do some of that well, and maybe the panel can answer that for me.
Well, so I have a lot of opinions on IP.
Yes, he does.
Go.
Shaking her head because we interact on those a lot. My personal opinion, unfortunately, it's a necessary evil that we have to work. Unfortunately, we spend a disproportionate amount of time working on IP. There's always the concern, speaking of Florida, that there's the next Gatorade that's going to fund everything that the university is going to miss. But the reality is most of the IP that's generated does not sit on its own and have a tremendous amount of value, or it's too early on to do it. And so I think this is where I do give Iowa State a lot of credit. They're trying to think about that and say, what is the IP that we need to work on? So I think it's tremendously important that universities wrap their head around the totality of what the IP is. And the example I give is, so with our center, we have nearly 30 members, and so IP is a huge discussion. Every time we talk to a new company, what are we going to do with IP? What are we going to do with IP? We've probably had 25 invention disclosures in our center. Only one of those has a company taken the license on. All the rest, the companies say we're intrigued, but they're too early on. And so, in fact, what we're finding is we're doing startup companies that are actually developing and de-risking the technology, and actually the companies like that model. Mm-hmm. So it's remarkable that we get stuck into this IP world, and yet it is probably 80% of the conversation we have with new companies on membership, whereas it's probably 5% of the impact of what our collaboration looks like down the road. So the 1%. Challenge. Yeah, 1% probably, you're right. So the challenge, I think, is to trying to work, and again, I appreciate that with Iowa State Office. They try to work with us to try to find something that's amenable and practical in this. And so we have to get a little bit out of this just classic ours, theirs, and share it into, come on, let's be realistic about this piece of IP. what's the logical place for it? So like in the case of germplasm, they said it doesn't make sense. We should just give it. There's other areas that are that way as well, that quite candidly we're probably better off as academic institutions just saying we vest that out with the company than to sit there and hold it and try to pay for the cost to maintain it, which are incredibly expensive.
And I've heard you say this before. What are the first two things the companies get from us, the best two things?
Yeah, so with the center, the best things they get are the students. They like the interaction. And then the networking with the other companies as well. And so the third one is they also like exposure to kind of cutting edge technologies. But IP is not in the top 3 or 5, even though that's 80% of our conversation with new companies.
Yep.
Great. I want to follow up just a little bit on a different aspect of the dynamic. And you may or may not have specific recollections or thoughts about this, but how about the dynamic of not so much the IP, but who's leading what? I'm sitting here as a psychologist and as a social psychologist, the interactions in the groups. For those of you who have been involved in these collaborations, I can imagine sticking points, what I sometimes call pinch points, about who's directing. We talked earlier, I heard about setting expectation, bringing value to the table, and I think this is wrapped up into that similarly, but I just want to hear a little bit about either experiences or suggestions, and this will tie into the last point in a few moments, but I want to start there if anyone has anything that they'd like to share about how to do it on a face-to-face, individual, in-the-room dynamic.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one answer to that question. I think it really depends on the nature of the collaboration. We've had one at Iowa State that was with a very large international oil company that, quite candidly, they put in a lot of money. They were the lead. There was no doubt about it. They came quarterly. They defined what they wanted to do. Sometimes changed on a short basis what they wanted to do, but they were driving the bus. There's absolutely no question about that. My personal, I love the ERC model because as director and I get NSF money, so we get a lot of control over the dynamic of that, but that's because of where the money flows. So I don't think there's a single answer to that. I think it's really tied up back into what are the expectations of the collaboration. And so I think that's part of setting up those expectations and dynamics actually, I don't think the answer is that hard. Whoever's putting up the resources is probably the one that's ultimately going to get to make the decisions.
Any other thoughts about that? Nope. No. Nobody really wanted to play with that one as much as I did. Well, that's all right. Lastly, I want you to think a little bit and share what you would see as best practices. How do we do this? And again, we've touched on some of the barriers, some of the challenges, and that would all be related. But if you were going to sit down and write a little primer about how to go about this, I don't have a clue how to go about it. I've heard some of these things. There are best practices actually written out of MIT, Sloan Management, from the business side about how to do academic collaborations. What would be your 5 points? And you can take a couple minutes if you want to think about it. What do you do? And I'd like to hear a little bit more. I asked about time, and it was implied that, you better give yourself some lead time for all of the necessary conversations, negotiations, et cetera. But what kind of time are we talking about? So just a little bit about definitely what we want to do and definitely what you should not do. You could think about it that way if it's easier.
So I'm not going to give 5. I'll give these guys a chance to think while I kind of give a different take on the answer.
Sure.
I work in the world of doing the contracting, so it may sound odd that I think that's the least important thing in all of this. The most important thing is the relationships. And if you don't put the effort in to build those relationships up front and then maintain them. It's not enough just to set the relationship, meet the person, come up with the common goal, and then go your separate ways. You have to maintain that relationship throughout the whole process. Because the best projects, the contract goes in a drawer and no one ever looks at it again. And if you have a great relationship, you can have a really bad contract and everything will turn out okay because the people are working together doing what's right. If you have a bad relationship, the best contract in the world isn't going to help because it's going to be bad. So that's my bias from what I see, are the successful collaborations are the ones built on good relationships.
And as a follow-up to that, in the development world, which is the professional fundraising world for universities, the typical response is it takes at least 3 to 5 years to build up a relationship in the corporate world where you can ask for a major gift. Major gift is anything around $1 million. So think about how long you date someone. That's what a major collaboration is. It is a marriage, because you're going to be partners and you have to figure out how to work through some tough issues. So do not walk into a business and expect to have one meeting with them and then hand over a $75,000 ask to have a research program funded in your area. I would hope that you have spent a long time cultivating probably somebody who you went to school with, somebody who is in your network of friends probably already, or that you meet at a professional conference, and you start having those long-term discussions of, hey, what are you doing? I'm in town, let's go out for dinner. Those do make a difference. And you know, we are looking at, for all of our major universities, we're putting together relationship management teams where we have 5 to 7 individuals at Pioneer corporate, and we're starting to bring in DuPont to manage a relationship with that particular university. And we're expecting a management team on the reverse side from the university. And it's to talk about these long-term things. Where do we want to invest? What's the win-win for both sides?
I'm about a week and a half away from my 23rd anniversary. I married my high school sweetheart, and we dated for 5.5 years before we got married, so that sounds like $1 million ask is in order. Or $1 million gift. Oh, $1 million gift, yeah, I got to be careful. For me, you know, I don't have this big corporate kind of thing going on so much in my world. And so with respect to my relationships that I chose with Van Meter Incorporated on this EPSCoR project and with Columbus Junction Community Schools, I'd already been working at Columbus Junction for quite a while on a lot of different projects, but not in the EPSCoR context. And I knew the person that was going to make all the difference in that relationship was going to be the building person, the building facilities person. Turns out that guy is also the IT guy, and he's also, you know, sweeps the sidewalk, and he does everything else. And before we set that relationship up, I wanted to meet that person, whoever that was. And once I met that person, and I gave some attributes of what that person had to be like before we were going to say yes to any work done in that context in Columbus Junction. And Todd Heck is that guy, and he's awesome, and we've been running with it. But to the point you made earlier, if someone else that's not Todd Heck shows up in that job, and we've had that happen before too, comes along board, boy, the relationship could change quite rapidly. And then with that person on board, the person closest to be the decision maker on the activities that we want to do in the partnership, then I move out in concentric circles. So then in the case of Columbus Junction, then it's the superintendent and the school board and some other folks, and building, you know, buy-in within that organization. Again, with that new person, that new relationship as a champion, as someone on the inside that you've invested in, that you match up with, that then can advocate for you. So, you know, kind of one cold call, so to speak, and if that cold call is successful, then you've got to use that relationship to build even more. And that's worked out really well. In the context of Van Meter Incorporated, is actually when Barry Butler was still our dean in the College of Engineering, had made some relationships with Van Meter, and they came for a, you know, hey, let's say hi to the college day. I met some folks from Van Meter, and this was 2 or 3 years before the EPSCoR project was funded. And I remembered that meeting, and I remembered what Van Meter does, and so I called them up, and sure enough, Tracy Klein has been working with us all along, and Tracy Klein is also that person in that relationship as well. And it's been quite successful from my vantage point in that sense.
Well, I hit 43 years of marriage on August 2nd, so we should compare notes. I think the important thing is it's not about you. If you're in a relationship with a company, it really is all about them. And as long as your #1 priority is meeting their needs, I mean, it comes back in multiples. So if it's all about you, it's going to be a short-term relationship. If it's all about how you serve them, then you've got the hope for a very, very successful relationship in so many ways.
Yeah, not to echo what everyone said, but I think the networking piece, a lot of the collaborations that I've had have started out of networking at conferences, things that you didn't necessarily know when you started the interaction that it was going to lead to that. Also, people that I've come back around later in my career that I knew earlier in my career has happened as well. But I think the other one that was just mentioned, I think, is also understanding the value proposition when you're talking with the companies. You know, what is your value proposition? And why is that a value proposition for whoever your collaborator is? I remember, again, I was at Shell for a number of years, and we worked in a certain catalyst area. And 2 years after I joined the academic world, I ran into a gentleman that was in the National Academy of Engineering and had written what he felt was the seminal research article on this type of catalyst that actually Shell was the world leader in. And I will not forget to this day his comment to me. He goes, I don't understand why Shell doesn't come to me and heap all this money on me because I've written the seminal article on this catalyst technology. Well, I have to tell you, I knew the Shell people, and they thought he was totally wrong, and that he was way off base, and the last person they would invest in was him. So there's a humbleness here that sometimes we in academics don't always have that speaks to the previous point of really understanding what the value proposition is with whoever we're collaborating with.
All right, just a note that when I ask about the psychology and face-to-face, I got nothing, and now we're dating, we have prenups, we're married, and it's all about the relationship.
Oh, there's the divorce part, too. We just haven't got to it yet.
I think we all know there have been the divorces as well. I want to leave plenty of time. We have just a lot of talent and experience up here, so I'm going to open it up. Ted, Jill, Asroon, if you all will grab the microphones, make sure they're on, because I want to have an opportunity for the audience to have questions.
I want to make just a quick comment. I tell you, you all are in the right spot. I mean, Iowa has a special place in history, and somebody mentioned Iowa history earlier, and I mean, we don't talk enough to our young people about what has actually come out of Iowa. And it's not just the computer at Iowa State. I mean, just so many. I've got a whole speech on all the inventions and successful people that have come out of Iowa, and I always end it with, so the question is Iowa better than sliced bread? And then I tell them that the guy that invented the bread slicer came from Bettendorf, Iowa, Otto Rohweder. I mean, Iowa is special. And you look at Lieutenant Governor Kim Reynolds, I mean, something that you may not know. She was named one of the 100 women in STEM last year, national publication group called STEM Connector. They just came out with 100 CEOs in STEM. Marianne Dringa, co-leader now of the STEM Council, is one of the 100 women in STEM, or CEOs in STEM in the United States. Kim Reynolds was just appointed the chair of the National STEM Connector Food and Ag Council. Paul Schickler is the vice chair of whatever it is. I mean, we are on the dime. I mean, in the end, for all of you that are here, that are Iowans, whether you're born here or live here, I mean, boy, let's take advantage and use it wisely.
Questions?
So I'm just curious about the idea that, at least for academics, most of the people that get involved in this stuff are sort of really forceful characters. And their projects tend to be personality dependent. It's really that person that drives it. My question for you guys is, how do you manage the succession issue? I mean, NSF asks when we do research sort of things, what do you do in case you croak out?
Oh my, now we're croaking out.
You know, I mean,
No,
I
I understand your point. I mean, we talked about sometimes on the industry side, someone leaves or gets transferred or what have you. And obviously, the same thing can happen either by virtue of leaving the institution, a retirement, croaking out. So does anybody have any experience or thoughts about how to manage that or at least plan for it? Can you?
Yeah, I don't mean to be a downer, but I'm not sure that there is a good answer to that. I think it is dependent on the people in the relationship, and it doesn't matter which side of that relationship that it leaves. It's very hard to have a succession plan for that. So I don't know that I have any great advice of maintaining that afterwards.
No, I think the only experience that I'm aware of with that is we did have a faculty member unexpectedly pass away a few years ago. And in that case, there was a graduate student far enough along in his career that was able to keep that going. But you can't always plan for that. I mean, you don't always have that senior postdoc or senior graduate student that's available.
And I guess, you know, some of that succession, we've just talked about the entrepreneurial nature of Iowa and Iowans and that sort of stuff. And sometimes when one person goes, it creates a void that must be filled by someone else. And you may not just want to carry the torch of someone else either. And so I don't know that that's really an amazing goal to have succession plans in that way. A lot of times old projects that maybe should die won't. And so, you know, so maybe some projects should croak along with
None of us know what you're talking about at all, Craig. We've never seen one of those.
Again, speaking as an assistant professor.
Yes, right.
Make some space.
Yeah, right. Wow, you looked at me when you said that. Thanks. See what I can do.
I love full professors. I love them all.
Yes, right. Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, see, I'm not on your committee, so. Other questions? Yes, we got one back here. Speak loudly, and I'll try to repeat it.
Joe's green. Anyway, simple question. You know, some collaborations you build, you go to a national meeting, a conference, and you can build collaborations with companies in your area, and that's pretty easy. The harder part is if you're trying to build it with local companies and you don't know the people, right? So what suggestions would the panel give for trying to build collaborations that are not sort of as obvious, right? Because you might not know the people involved, you might not see them at national meetings, so they might be a little bit farther topically, right? So for faculty to try to do things.
I think if it's a local company, you might not know them, but I guarantee you know someone who does know them. So use that secondary connection. A lot of times that's a role, or there'll be somebody in your university that kind of has that role. That's one of the things I do. If people have a company that they don't know anybody in, that they want to get introduced, I either know somebody or I know somebody who knows somebody, and you can help facilitate that introduction. But don't be afraid to ask people to help facilitate the introductions.
At a total risk of pimping out your development staff at your university, get a hold, and this is part of their job, get a hold of your development officer that sits in your college and say, hey, I need somebody at XYZ company. Do we have any alumni that work there? Or they might actually surprise you and say, well, wouldn't you know their CEO is one of our best donors. So that's a built-in resource for you right there.
I guess I would also add to that is that's the first part. But the second part is you have to be willing. I want to reemphasize what was said earlier. You have to be willing for that to have a gestation period from that original conversation. It's not like you finally get an audience and then you expect to have a contract in 3 months. You know, it's really going to be a case of you start the dialogue, find out what their needs are, and it's going to take some time to hit on the right one where the collaboration makes sense. So unfortunately, I don't know that there's a shortcut for that. It just takes time to develop that. And certainly one would hope, you know, the universities or the community colleges there the businesses close to them, they have some of that. And so you try to build into that infrastructure that's there so that you have that longer term. So that's the continuity piece, in my opinion, a little bit, is can you maintain as the entity of the community college, of the university, of industry in that local area, that relationship, so that when the right opportunity percolates up, that there is that kind of interaction possible.
We have time for a couple more. Going?
We're standing in between them and lunch.
That's right.
So if an assistant professor has an idea for a collaboration with a large company, are they better off trying to go to a senior person to try to work that collaboration, a department chair or a senior faculty member, somebody who has some experience with this, or will just be seen as a leader at that university, or should they go ahead and try to develop these relationships themselves?
Yes. Yeah, I think you need to do both.
I agree too. I've been at the university for 20 years, so I've seen senior faculty in my department in particular build those relationships. But some of that is incongruent with, again, the tenure clock. And so if you have to wait 3 years for some sort of courtship or gestation, all the different metaphors we've used for building a relationship, that can be a little bit of a challenge then for you with respect to getting tenure on the typical 6-year clock. But I think the other thing we've heard today is the need to diversify our research portfolios as assistant professors. I think we have to be entrepreneurial in nature, perhaps a little bit more than has been the case in the last 20 years, and we'll probably in the next 10 years you'll have to be even a little bit more entrepreneurial yet. And so, and some of that's a little bit daunting. I feel it at times, and I think you have to try a variety of things. But yes, make sure your department chair knows about it. Make sure that they are on board with such things. I'm also a part of a large research institute at the University of Iowa, and so my folks there know about it as well. And then yes, the full professors that I've worked with over the years, they know about it as well. So get lots of advice, get lots of tips, and then work hard and try to be scholarly about it when you're on the back end of it all.
One last question. All right. Well, please join me in thanking our panel. Oh, is there another one here?
Just one final piece. Is this one?
No.
All right. In talking about the pre-industrial stage, as you're starting to think about building these collaborations, maybe a comment as to when do let's say the university or the partners start thinking about confidentiality agreement, material transfer agreement, non-disclosure agreements, at what stage should they be thinking about that as they build a collaboration? I think that would be important.
So what stage in the process do we literally start the negotiations about the various documents and agreements that need to be in place?
Yeah, in my mind, that starts when the two parties think there's a basis for a collaboration, and then do it as early as possible. As soon as that happens, don't be running off and making plans that we're already going to be hiring graduate students or other workers until because those documents can take a while sometimes. So the answer is, as soon as it looks like it's moving forward, absolutely get those folks involved at that point so that it can move as expeditiously as possible.
Sooner is better. All right, again, thank you all very much.